So I love knitting beanies or hats or toques or whatever you want to call them. I'll be going through my beanie collection. I'm really excited to dive into each one and talk about what I think about all of them. Hi everyone, welcome to or welcome back to my channel, Knee Knits. My name is Amy and here I talk about all things knitting, and today's video is a beanie roundup. I'll be going through my beanie collection and rating each hat for both knitting experience and wearing experience, so we'll find out which of these 6 beanies are my favorite to wear and favorite to knit. So I love knitting beanies or hats or toques or whatever you want to call them. It actually is what got me into knitting and what made me love knitting the most. I just love hat projects. They're very fast and satisfying because you can finish them in a short amount of time, but they're also super practical to wear. I live in New England where we have pretty strong winters, and beanies are a necessity if you're going outside at any point in time in the winter or sometimes the fall and early spring. So I definitely have a lot of good use and good purpose for beanies, and I've been knitting a lot of them throughout the years. Recently, I decided to knit a bunch of beanies of different patterns just so I could get a feel for what's out there. So I have my beanie collection here of the beanies that I rotate through and wear regularly. A lot of these patterns are very popular patterns. If you search on Ravelry for hat patterns, these come up in like the top 2 or 3 pages of hat patterns. So I'm really excited to dive into each one and talk about what I think about all of them. So for each of the beanies here, I'm going to talk about the pattern, the design, the yarn that I used, the size that I made, the needles that I used, and I'll also talk about how I felt the knitting experience as a whole was. I will rate it out of 10, and then I will talk about the wearing experience of each hat, also rate it out of 10, and then I'll take the average of those 2 scores to give an overall score out of 10 for each of these hats. But before we get started, I do want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. Being on YouTube, there's obviously a lot of video production that goes on to make my videos come to life, and I'm always looking for ways to cut back on my editing time or give myself more time to knit and work on my projects. I use Final Cut Pro to edit all of my videos, and I'm really glad to have found a learning path on Skillshare titled Edit Eye-Catching Videos with Final Cut Pro. If you are unfamiliar with Skillshare, they are the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry pros in a whole variety of topics including film, illustration, design, crafting, and more. Skillshare connects you with teachers and other members to create a community of like-minded creatives who are looking to accelerate their skills. Learning paths are curated sequential class collections to master a specific skill or competency, such as editing with Final Cut Pro. So if you want to invest in yourself by learning a new skill or hobby, head to the link in my description to join Skillshare today. The first 500 people to use my link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. And thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. All right, let's get into the first hat. I am going to start with the Oslo Hat. The Oslo Hat is a pattern by Petite Knit. It is a DK weight knit and it comes in a variety of sizes. For the Oslo Hat original pattern, the suggested needle size is 3.5 millimeters, and it uses a range of 100 to 150 grams of fingering weight yarn depending on what size you're making. If you're making the adult sizes, you will need more than 100 grams. I on average use about 115 to 120 grams of yarn to make a Oslo hat that fits my head. You might notice I have 2 here. I grabbed both. So this green one is mine that I knit out of Sanasgarn Peer Gynt in the color Petroleum. Now Peer Gynt is a DK weight yarn, so I did just hold this single on the 3.5 millimeter needles to knit the entire hat. This gray one here is my husband's, and I knit this out of Filcolana Arwetta, which is a sock yarn, and I held it double on 3.5 millimeter needles in, I don't know the color name, but it's like a charcoal gray. So this is the outside appearance of the Oslo hat. You can see it has a very clean folded brim, and it has a 4 pointed crown, or it has the 4 lines for the crown. You do knit it from the bottom up, and I'll unfold it to sort of show you the construction in case you're unfamiliar with it. This is a popular pattern, so you might have heard this a lot before. But you cast on from the bottom and you knit in stockinette until it is twice the brim length, and then you connect your cast on edge with your live knitting edge to sort of fold up that brim, and then you continue knitting for about an inch before you do a short row turn, which allows you to flip your work inside out, and then you continue knitting the rest of the hat in stockinette before you do the crown decreases. So that short row turn allows you to have a brim that folds up like this, And so you have your folded brim and then your stockinette body all on the same side. Because the brim is a folded 2-layer of stockinette fabric, and then you also have that 3rd layer of the body knitting in there, that brim is very thick. It's 3 layers of DK weight yarn, so it's a very warm hat, and especially depending on the fiber you use, it can be very warm and very cozy. Definitely really adjustable depending on how tall or short you want the brim or how tall or short you want the crown of the head. You can just adjust those accordingly. The style is pretty classic. I like to equate this with a Carhartt beanie that is a very popular commercially sold hat, and it does have a little poof here. I think I just followed the regular pattern directions for my size, so if you follow the directions as written, you'll get the same kind of poof and a pretty wide brim, which I like. I personally really like wide brims for both warmth reasons and aesthetic reasons. Now, for the knitting process, my rating of how I liked knitting the Oslo hat, I generally really enjoy it. It is mostly stockinette in the round, which to me is very enjoyable. There's enough going on in the pattern where it keeps you engaged and you're not knitting for too long without any like action or excitement. So I feel like it's hard to get bored with the Oslo hat. I think folding up the brim and doing the turn can be tricky at first. A lot of knitters do have difficulty figuring out how the pattern is written and what it actually means. So that can be tricky, but once you do it once and master it, it's kind of easy to do your next Oslo hat. One thing I don't really love about knitting the Oslo hat is it does need more than 100 grams of yarn to make an adult size. Knowing that a lot of skeins of yarn are sold in 100-gram quantities, I find myself wanting to make an Oslo hat but not having enough yarn, and it creates sort of an issue, or you need to get creative with how to use that yarn if you really want to use it, either by shortening the brim or using scrap yarn for the interior that's not visible, or shortening the crown. So all of those factors combined, I would rate my knitting experience for the Oslo hat at a 7 out of 10. As for wearing it and rating how I like wearing it, like I said before, it's very thick at the brim, super warm and cozy, so I really enjoy that. The 3 layers of DK weight fabric, that's really warm. I will note that I find the fold to be not the smoothest, and I'll take this off, and I feel like I need to preface that I'm not responsible for how my hair looks in this video, since I'll be putting on and taking off so many hats. Although you do have some sort of natural fold lines, I find that the Oslo hat doesn't really fold exactly where you turn the work, so you do have some stockinette that rolls over, which I think is on purpose because it makes it very clean and you have absolutely no purl bumps showing on the outside. But I find without blocking, and I usually block my hats, but if you don't block it, you do get kind of like a bubble where that purl ridge is, and it just kind of like, it looks a little weird and can add some extra bulk. And even after blocking, I feel like you can still see there is just a little bubbling where those purl bumps are. Sometimes I find the crown of the hat to be just a little bit too poofy, depending on how I'm feeling that day with my outfit. Sometimes I just don't want this much poof. So all of that combined, I would rate the wearability of this hat at a 7 out of 10. Both the knitting experience and wearability is being rated at 7, so this gives the Oslo hat an overall score of 7 out of 10. The next hat I'll talk about is the Musselburgh hat by Isolde Teague. Now this is the most popular hat pattern on Ravelry ever. It has like the most amount of projects, and for great reasons. It's a very versatile pattern. In fact, there was recently just a pattern update within the last few weeks that has made this more versatile than ever. It's essentially a gaugeless pattern, and you can use any yarn ranging from light fingering to DK weight. The concept is that you start working at one crown, so you do have to start with a very small circumference cast on. There are a few different methods about how to do that and video tutorials online, and then you do increases for the crown, and in the middle of doing your crown increases, you will stop and measure your gauge. You'll measure how many stitches per 1 inch you have in your hat, and then that will direct you to what stitch count you should increase to and the dimensions that you should knit to for your specified size hat. So a ton of flexibility there. The fact that you don't have to gauge swatch before casting on is incredible. Every knitter I think would love that. And once you get past the crown increases, you can shift this hat onto a 16-inch circular, and then you just knit and stockinette for a really long time. And for me personally, I really enjoy that. I think it makes a great portable, mindless project if you need something on the go, transit knitting, movie knitting, and there's just a lot of stockinette. And I will unfold it here, and you can see how much stockinette that I knit on my Musselburgh hat. And of course, you can vary it depending on how tall you want your hat to be. And then when you're finally done knitting all the stockinette, you do some crown decreases, which are pretty standard hat decreases, and then you'll finish it off, weave in your ends, and then you have to do a little zhuzhing to fold it up, and then you have a wearable hat. For my hat here specifically, I did use a fingering weight yarn. This is Dirty Water Dye Works Lucia fingering in the color Sprinkle, which has all these beautiful speckles of purple, blue, and green. I ended up using a 3.25 millimeter needle, and I used pretty much the whole 100 gram skein for my hat. So this is the hat folded up once, and then I do have enough length to give it another fold, and therefore I have this folded brim that I personally really like. And this is the fit on my head. You can see where the fold is right there. It's got a little bit of poof on top. It's exactly what I want in a style of hat. Folded brim, poof. So for the knitting experience of this hat, I would rate this a 9 out of 10. The only thing that doesn't make the knitting process a 10 out of 10 is the fact that you have to do the pinhole cast on and do increases either on DPNs or a magic loop before the hat really gets going. But it's such a short amount of time, and then you get into the stockinette so fast. I think the long stretch of stockinette in this hat could be seen as a con. For me personally, I enjoyed knitting it, but I can totally understand if you are dreading the idea of doing a 20-inch long stockinette tube and fingering weight yarn. As for the wearability of this hat, I actually wear this hat a lot. It was actually my most worn hat this past winter, and I find it just super easy to throw on. It has no fussiness. It does have the 4-pointed crown, so you know, I can put this on in any way and it doesn't matter. It's always like facing the right way. The folded brim is super warm because I have this here. It's essentially 4 layers of fingering weight fabric on my head, keeping my ears nice and toasty. I also really love how there's no bumps or weird shaping going on at the brim. It's just pure stockinette fabric that folds where you want it to fold, and so you really have a hat that molds to your head, and over time it just, you know, it stretches to the shape of your head. The folds will start to wear in, so if you have it set up the way you want to, it's going to be a perfectly fitting hat in just a few weeks of wearing it. I think the style is pretty timeless. You could make this in any sort of color, a neutral, a bright, or a fun speckle like this, and have a variety of different hats that fit a lot of different outfits. So I would rate this a 10 out of 10 for wearability. So with a 9 out of 10 knitting rating and a 10 out of 10 wearability rating, this hat gets an overall score of 9.5. Next up is the Weekend Hat by Petite Knit. This is a DK weight knit hat. The recommended needle size is 3.5 millimeter needles. It is knit from the bottom up, and it's all 1x1 rib. And the pattern has you do a double fold for a triple layer brim. So this is it unfolded, and it ends with a 4-pointed crown for the shaping, which you can see here. The yarn that I use for this hat is Night Bright Yarn Co.'s Bright DK, which is a 100% superwash DK weight yarn in the color Starfish. And I used about 115 grams to make the adult medium hat for myself. Because it's knit bottom up and you end up folding the brim twice, your cast on style doesn't really matter. It's going to be invisible, so in terms of visual aesthetics of your cast on, it doesn't matter. It just has to be stretchy enough to stretch around your head. So I just did mine with a long tail cast on, and you knit this in 1x1 rib, but you do stop every once in a while to do 2 sections of double knitting, which you might be able to see a little bit here. Yeah, it looks better in that angle. So you have some double knitting, which essentially creates fold lines for your hat, which makes it very easy to fold up. You can see how the fold kind of just appears because of those double knitting rounds. And I found that the double knitting rounds really broke up the long stretch of 1x1 rib. So the pattern kept me pretty engaged in that sense, and I didn't really feel like a slog. I don't really have any interesting notes on the crown. It's pretty standard. You do have one middle stitch, and then you have 2 surrounding stitches to create this nice crown shaping with a column of 3 stitches going up each side. And it creates a pretty, you know, standard hat shape with the big fat brim. So for the knitting rating of this hat, I would rate this a 5 out of 10. It is all 1x1 rib, which is less than ideal. I think a lot of people don't really like knitting 1x1 rib endlessly, and this is pretty much an endless 1x1 rib hat. I did mention the double knitting made it go by faster, but it still is nothing compared to an all stockinette hat. This hat also requires more than 100 grams of yarn if you're making an adult size, which I don't really love, like I mentioned with the Oslo hat, all those same reasons. So that's why I'm going to leave the rating somewhat low at 5. Now, for the wearability of this hat, It's just okay. I think in general, my personal preference is I don't really love ribbed hats. I find they are super like form fitting to my head shape, which I don't know, I just don't really like the aesthetic of. I find stockinette hats have a little bit better shaping on my head. And of course with 1x1 rib, it's going to be very tight. I also find that the double knitting lines, although in theory are supposed to help with the folding, they don't really do much. You can see how they're not really aligned. Honestly, I would have preferred the look of this hat without them entirely because it's kind of a distraction from the pattern to have this weird break both here and here, and it just kind of looks confusing. The crown shaping on my head is just okay. I did mention with the 1x1 rib, it's very tight and then just kind of comes up to a little point at the top. I didn't really grab this hat too much this past winter. I just didn't want to put it on my head. It was going to leave ribbing lines on my forehead, and I don't really love how the crown looks on my head with this like sharp little point, so I'm gonna rate the wearability at a 4 out of 10. So combining my knitting score at 5 out of 10 and my wearability score at 4 out of 10, the weekend hat gets an overall score of 4.5 out of 10. My next hat to discuss is the Brownstone Beanie by Tori Yu. This hat is knit bottom up with fingering weight yarn, and you have to use fingering weight yarn because you actually use fingering weight yarn both held single in this pattern and double, so you have 2 different needle sizes, 2 different gauges to get you this finished hat. It does have the crisp folded brim and a fun little asymmetrical crown shaping at the top. The suggested needle sizes for this hat include both a 3.25mm needle and a 3.75mm needle, and you can knit all of the sizes in the pattern ranging from baby to adult large with less than 100 grams of fingering weight yarn. So really interesting construction with this hat. I will unfold it so you can see the full structure of it. It is knit bottom up, so you cast on with a regular long tail cast on and you knit the brim with the fingering yarn held single. There is also a turn involved, again very similar to the Oslo Hat, which allows the brim to be facing outward. You can see all those purl bumps that are created with the turn, so when you fold it all up, all you have is stockinette on the outside of the hat. You will notice that the wrong side is pretty long, and one issue that I do experience with my hat a little bit is that it really kind of peeks out just slightly with the brim. So if I were to reknit this, I would make this section a lot shorter. I don't think there's any benefit to having this many rounds of wrong side facing out, so that's just something that I noted while knitting this pattern. And then for the crown shaping, really cool design there. I don't know if this type of crown shaping has a name, but it is asymmetrical, so I say that so you have the front and the back is the same, but from the other direction it's not the same, and you do wear it with this side as sort of the front side. I really had a good time knitting this hat. I knit this out of a fingering weight sock yarn by Keats Garn in the color Victoria, which is this really fun hot pink purple color, and I think that there was enough in the pattern of just plain stockinette but also like exciting construction to keep me engaged. Like it was a portable project, but then when I got bored with the all stockinette, there was something cool to do, like fold up the brim or turn the work or start the crown decreases. The crown decreases do have a high risk of laddering, which is mentioned in the pattern, and I experienced that. This was my very first time knitting the pattern, so I didn't really do too much to mitigate it. If I make another one in the future, I am going to try to adjust my tension to make sure I don't really have these very large gaps in the future. You do finish the hat off with a Kitchener stitch. This is what it looks like on. So I really like knitting this. I think it's pretty genius that you can use the fingering weight yarn held both single and double in the same pattern, which allows you to get this very crisp style hat with less than 100 grams of yarn, which is a big thumbs up for me. With all of that being said, I would rate the knitting experience of this hat at a 7 out of 10. As for wearing it, I do really like the style. It is kind of like a specific style, so if you don't like the style hat with the really large crown and poof on the top of your head, you might not like it, but I really like it. I think combined with the crisp folded brim and just being a stockinette fabric, I really like the shape that it creates on my head. It's kind of hard to determine how many layers are in this brim because you do have the folded brim, which has 2 layers of fingering weight, but then you have the third layer, which is a DK weight. So I guess that would be equivalent to 2 layers of DK weight. So pretty equivalent to the Musselburgh hat, which has 4 layers of fingering weight. which is the same. Compared to the Oslo Hat, however, not going to be as warm, as the Oslo Hat has 3 whole layers of DK weight yarn. One thing to note with this hat, like I did mention, the asymmetrical crown, you do have to know which side you're putting on your head. You can't just throw it on blindly because it's not perfectly symmetrical in a circular way. That's like one thing that might not make this the perfect hat, because you do have to look at it before you put it on. You can't just blindly put it on, because then you could have it facing the wrong way and then it would look a little weird. Really comfortable. It does really mold to my head shape. I would say there is maybe the same risk of having the bump from the pearl fold underneath the brim, but I think because this is a thinner fabric, it doesn't really show as much compared to the Oslo Hat, so I would give the wearability of this hat an 8 out of 10. Combining my knitting rating at 7 out of 10 and the wearability rating at 8 out of 10, this hat gets an overall score of 7.5 out of 10. My next beanie is the Robin Beanie by Sari Nordland. This is a top-down 2x2 ribbed beanie that features a double folded brim, but you do have the options to knit it with a single folded brim or no brim. It is very customizable. The Robin Beanie is a DK weight knit hat. The suggested needle size is 3mm needles. The yarn that I use for my hat is Originally Lovely Pura, which was gifted to me. This is in the color Dusk, and it's a 100% merino DK weight yarn. So the construction of this hat, like I just mentioned, is top down, so you do have to start with a small circumference cast on and then increase out using DPNs or a magic loop until you get to a circumference that's wide enough for a 16-inch circular. I did have some issues with the pattern where the number of stitches it asked to cast on. I couldn't really close my hole, like there were so many stitches that no matter how hard I pulled my tail end, it wouldn't really close up. So I did have to make a modification and cast on half the amount of stitches, and then in my very first row increase up to the correct stitch count. From there you start doing increases with 2x2 ribbing, and I found that my increases are kind of messy. Increases, if you do just a make one left or a make one right, they pull on the round beforehand since you're creating a stitch out of nothing before, so it does affect the tension, and I find that it's very visible in my crown. And you can sort of see the irregularity of the increase column compared to the regular columns of ribbing. But once you finish the crown, it is just all 2x2 ribbing until you get to the length that you want. This pattern is advertised as a stash buster pattern, so there is a specified length that you can knit the hat to get the double folded brim. However, you can stop at any point if you run out of yarn or don't want to have such a thick brim or such a tall brim. And knitting top down as opposed to bottom up gives you a little bit more flexibility because you only have to estimate how much yarn you need left for a bind off, as opposed to sort of estimating or guesstimating how much yarn you'll need left to do an entire crown and then binding off. The overall knitting experience of this hat I didn't really love. I did mention how I don't like the crown increases. I think they're very messy with the increase method that was specified in the pattern, and then it's just so much 2x2 ribbing that I found to be very boring, and it's really long. It felt like it never ended. And then I did end up doing a tubular cast off because I wanted to make sure that my cast off edge was really stretchy, since that was the part that would be going around my head. I find standard bind offs to be very tight, so I knew I couldn't do that, and the tubular cast off was a bit more work than a regular cast off. All of those factors combined, I would rate the knitting experience of this hat at a 4 out of 10. Was not my preferred method of hat knitting and was not very enjoyable. As for the finished product, I do really like wearing this hat, although, I had some qualms knitting it. Wearing it I find to be much better. I do really like the double folded brim. You can see it's very tall, which I like, and the crown is also very tall. Definitely a stylistic choice, but I personally really like the aesthetic of how this hat looks. It's definitely a statement piece, and it's definitely very warm. When you have 3 layers of DK weight fabric surrounding your ears, and then you have this really tall crown, which I think kind of helps with the ribbing because, like I mentioned with the weekend hat, the ribbing is very tight on my head and then the point is just kind of there and it looks weird. But with this hat, because the crown is so tall, you don't really get a lot of like weird shaping. It kind of just goes straight up and I think looks a lot cleaner than the very tight 1x1 weekend hat crown. Folding up the 2x2 rib, you know, without any weird fold lines or anything, you know, it is another type of fabric that I find molds to my head very well. Over time, it has kind of stretched and sort of remembered where I fold it, so that way I can just pop this on without any issue. Sometimes you can see where the inner layer is poking through because it doesn't really go all the way down all the time, but I don't really find that to be that much of a problem. And I wore this hat a lot this winter. It's just really warm, it's really cute, and just really easy to throw on without any fuss, without any bumps. It's always good to go. So I would rate the wearability of this hat at a 9 out of 10. It was one of my favorites. So combining the knitting score of 4 out of 10 with the wearability at 9 out of 10, that brings the Robin Beanie to an overall score of 6.5 out of 10. The last hat in my collection that I'll be talking about today is my Manhattan hat by Tori Yu. This is one of my more recently finished knit hats, so it didn't have a full winter season of wear, but I definitely wore it a lot recently in just the past 2.5 weeks that I've had it. This hat is knit bottom up, and it's an all over 1x1 ribbed hat, and it finishes with that sort of asymmetrical crown shape. Knit in worsted weight yarn, the recommended needle size is 3.75 millimeters, and there are multiple brim options in the pattern if you choose to do no brim, a single brim, or a double folded brim. It does give different yardage amounts for all of those options. I opted for the single folded brim and used 80 grams of the worsted weight yarn. If you go for the double folded brim, you will need more than 100 grams of worsted weight yarn. For knitting this hat, and I will be speaking just about the single folded brim option since that's what I have here. If you do the single fold, your cast on does end up being visible, so you do have to make sure your cast on edge is something that you're happy with. I opted for the tubular cast on, which is what was recommended in the pattern, and I think gives the cleanest look with the 1x1 rib. And once you cast on, you just knit 1x1 rib until you're ready to do the crown decreases. Once you get to the crown decreases, you have a few different options, which is pretty cool. You can choose to do purlwise decreases, and then your right side will be facing out when the hat is finished, and that ends with a Kitchener stitch at the top of the hat. Or you can choose to do knitwise decreases, and when you're finished with the hat, your wrong side will become the right side of the hat, and you finish off the hat with a 3-needle bind off. So there's a lot of flexibility with how you want to finish your crown, with which side of your ribbing you want to be facing out of your finished hat, and I think that's really cool. I think that's great flexibility to have in a pattern. Remember, this also had the different brim options, so super customizable. I enjoyed knitting the crown decreases for mine. I did opt for the purlwise decreases, and I think they look really clean. You can see because it's 1x1 rib, it's a little bit different than the Brownstone Beanie decreases. In fact, I'll just hold them both up here. You can see with the Manhattan hat that is ribbed, there's no laddering at all. There really was no risk of laddering. There was no warning in the pattern for that, so I think it looks really clean. And my Kitchener stitch is okay. I couldn't quite figure out how to do the 1x1 ribbed Kitchener stitch, but that's on me. Maybe it's on the pattern. There was no tutorial linked in the pattern, so the knitter is kind of on their own to figure out how to do it correctly. Overall, I had a good time knitting this hat. It didn't get too boring. It might be because this is just single folded and not double folded, so by the time I was getting tired of the 1x1 ribbing, it was ready to start the crown decreases. I would rate the knitting experience of this hat at a 7 out of 10. As for wearing this hat, I generally enjoy it. It definitely is a very stylistic hat. You have to commit to the style of the really tall cone, or of the really tall crown combined with the 1x1 ribbing. But I mean, it looks pretty good. I mean, you guys know I don't love the 1x1 ribbed hats on my head. I don't like how they really suck in and then go out at the top. This one kind of has the same effect as the weekend hat, but I think this crown shaping just looks a little bit more stylish than the crown shaping of the weekend hat, so I wouldn't rate it as low as that one. Really comfortable brim on my ears. It is just a single fold, so nothing complex, no weird bumps. It does really mold to your head shape, and you can adjust it however you want. If you want less poof at the top, you can do less poof. If you want more, you can do more. So I would rate the wearability of this hat at a 6 out of 10, and combining that with my knitting score of 7 out of 10, that gives the Manhattan hat an overall score of 6.5 out of 10. So those were all of my hats. Really fun to go through all of them. In summary, my overall favorite hat was the Musselburgh. You really can't beat it, both the knitting and the wearability of it. It's just a great transportable, mindless project, and I find it just super easy to throw on at any point in time. This is my only Musselburgh in my collection, but I would love to add more to my collection in the future, perhaps in some more neutral colors to go with a little bit more of my outfits. The lowest rated hat in my collection is the weekend hat. It just fell short. It is really hard to put on because it's so tight. I don't really like how the crown looks on my head, and the double knitting kind of just affects all the folds in a weird way that I don't love. I didn't really reach for it this much this past winter and would not really be interested in making another one. So that concludes today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed going through all of my hats like I did. Maybe you got something out of it, maybe you didn't. Let me know your favorite beanie pattern in the comments, and maybe I will do a part 2 to this next winter. I'm sure I'll be trying a bunch of new hat patterns over the course of the next year. Would love to revisit to see if I have a new favorite. Thank you all for watching today, and thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Don't forget that the first 500 people to click the link in my description box will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so be sure to head there today. Bye!